Hey guys, I'm Natalie Hodge. Welcome to SnapComms, where we bring you news in a snap. Caribe Wave is a regional tsunami exercise that the Virgin Islands has participated in since 2009. Each year, organizers choose a different tsunami event from history and create a simulation exercise based on it. Joining me on today's program is Acting Director of the Department of Disaster Management, Mr. Jason Penn. Welcome, Mr. Penn.
Thank you, Natalie.
All right, now we know that the Virgin Islands participates in the Caribe Wave exercise every year. Tell us what we can do to prepare for a tsunami, and how can we identify a tsunami wave?
Okay, that's a very good question, Natalie. The way we prepare for a tsunami is actually having a kit, having a household kit where you would have important documents, flashlights. We're in a COVID era now, so you have your mask, hand sanitizer, even sanitary wipes if you don't have hand sanitizer, your important documents, as well as maybe an extra pair of shoes and any type of medication that you might need. By having that kit prepared in the event that you have to evacuate, then that would have been prepared beforehand. Now, what you should note though, in preparation for a tsunami, what I should highlight before the tsunami, there's actually earthquakes. So if there's an earthquake, what you're expected to do is to drop, cover, and hold in the place that you are. Once the shaking has stopped and it's safe to evacuate, you evacuate at that time. Some of the signs that you can use to identify a tsunami, especially if you're living close to the coast, is if you see the water recedes. If you see the water recedes, then there's an indication that a tsunami may have been generated. And also you can listen out for maybe a loud roar. You may hear an unusual roar that's coming from the ocean. That might be the big waves that are approaching. So that's also an indication that you would need to evacuate and move to higher ground.
All right, now, as you speak about higher ground, what happens if I can't get to higher ground? What is your recommendation for that?
Well, if you can't get to higher ground, and for instance, there's maybe a building or something that's, that hasn't been damaged within an earthquake, it may be a tsunami that's distant. Typically, that's a tsunami that's between over an hour to maybe 3 hours away. What you can do, if you can't get to higher ground and there's a high-rise building that is secure, you may think of going up to the highest floor that you can get to, or some high point within a structure that might give you a chance of saving your lives or the lives of your loved ones.
So what happens, how do you determine when it's safe to return to a coastal or low-lying area after a tsunami?
That's very good. It's typically determined, that would be determined by, well, we have a multi-hazard alerting system and we have a number of different protocols that we're supposed to follow. I'll give a quick example. God forbid if there was a tsunami warning or a tsunami for the Virgin Islands and we had to evacuate, and it did happen, then that would be determined based on the information we receive from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, and we'll do our best to ensure to individuals after an initial damage assessment is done to ensure that it's safe enough to return to the coast. We would then make that announcement as best as we can to individuals that is now safe to return. I don't think that it would be safe to just return right after an initial wave, because you never know, there might be continuous waves that would be following the one that may have just came in and caused damage. So the best thing might be to allow us as the individuals, the authorities, do the initial assessments, say that it's okay now to return, and persons can go back and continue from there.
Okay, what happens if a tsunami happens in the middle of the night? Is the alert system territory-wide so that everyone across the territory can hear that there's impending danger?
Well, what I would say, there are a number of different systems that we use to try to alert the population. We have a number of sirens, but it's fair to say the sirens would not be heard across the entire territory. They have been installed in strategic locations to try and alert as much persons as possible. We also have our app that individuals can download to their smartphones, where we try to use those. We have systems that are connected to the various radio stations. We also have systems that are within different buildings that also gives off a particular type of alert. We have social media. We have various WhatsApp groups. We have access to the SMS platform via the partnerships we have with the service providers. So of course we would use every mean to try and alert persons as best as possible, to in essence of sharing information. If I'm going back, I think you mentioned about it happening in the evening, in the middle of the night, the first thing you should do is not just run and jump off of your bed. If for instance, if it's an event that's local, and you feel an earthquake or you feel your room shaking, it's maybe best to stay in the place. If you're on bed, you stay on your bed and you try and protect yourself without jumping off of the bed and running. If you're up, then you do the same job, cover and hold, and you protect yourself then. And at that time, if you, as I mentioned earlier about having your kit, you take your kit and then you'll evacuate to higher ground. But if it's a distant tsunami where you may not have felt anything, and we have to then issue some type of alert to the population, of course, then you'll grab your kit, ensure that you have everything that you need. Again, don't forget, we're in the COVID-19 era. You need to have your mask, your sanitizer, and all your sanitized peripherals, and then you can leave and move to a higher ground. And what will also be important as well, in times like this, depends on where you live, it's best to know what your evacuation route is, whether it's in the day or even in the night. So if you have to move, it will make it easier for you to evacuate as well. And if a warning is issued and you have to evacuate and you can't move by foot, that might be the best course of action to get to one of those safe zones. God, for everybody to try and jump in their cars at the same time, whether it's night or it's day, you can potentially injure or kill persons trying to evacuate quickly, or you can injure your family as well. Okay?
Well, that's good to hear you talk about staying in bed if there's an earthquake. I wasn't aware of that, but usually when there's an earthquake, I stay in bed. So it's good to know I've been doing the right thing. Now, question, as you mentioned, knowing your evacuation routes. Personally, do you have an evacuation route from your home?
Yes, I do have an evacuation route. Okay. My family is familiar with the evacuation routes, and I will encourage those that don't know your evacuation routes. You can reach out to the department. There were a number of different routes that were created for persons to show persons where particular safe locations are. Okay. So that's something that we can provide if persons want to know exactly maybe where they can go based on where they live. We might be able to point out the key routes that have been earmarked. What the public would have noticed as well, there are a number of different tsunami signs throughout the territory, and those typically lead to particular high points where persons can seek safety.
Okay. Now, you spoke earlier about the coronavirus pandemic that we're going through, and those that needs to be considered in terms of our evacuation. Now, in terms of the evacuation, what special considerations should be taken in terms of not the sanitary items, but in moving in groups, in large groups, when you have to evacuate?
I think that we should still pay attention to the protocols that have been established. Try and distance yourself as much as possible. Ensure to always wear your mask. Wear your mask when you're evacuating, because again, we're living in a COVID-19 time. We have other hazards that we have to deal with. Tsunami evacuations is one of them, but we still owe it to ourselves to keep ourselves safe and to keep our colleagues and our families safe. So if we have to evacuate, practice the protocols that are established. Wear your mask, try and distance yourself as possible, or even when you're at the evacuation site, you try your best to maintain your distance, even when roll call is taking place.
All right, it's good to know. Now, you mentioned something earlier, but I wanted to go back and talk about it a bit more. We've had some pretty strong earthquakes occurring recently in the territory, and I want you to stress to our listening and viewing audience what the procedures are for when there's an earthquake. You're at work in the middle of the day, and there's an earthquake. Pretty strong, the building is shaking. What should you do?
Well, the procedures for earthquake, if you're at work during the day, I mentioned it before. You drop, cover, and hold, or if you could find something that's sturdy, that's strong enough that you can get under, you could shelter under that object as well. If you're working and you're walking by the coast, you pay attention to those signs that I mentioned to earlier as well. The reason I said that, the reason I'm saying this is the fact that depends on how strong this earthquake is. If it's a local event and you realize that structures are severely damaged, you realize that the floor or floors, roof tiles, things have moved pretty much from where they were, then once you've determined that it's safe after the earthquake, your best option is then to move, even if you don't hear any of the warning devices or the alert mechanisms that we might have. Observe, if you're by the coast, again, I'll stress, observe the differentiation of maybe the waves, the seas, to see if they recede, to see if you hear that loud roar. But specifically, if you're working, you do your drop, cover and hold, or find that sturdy piece of furniture to shelter under. Once it's finished and it's obvious that extreme damage has occurred, even without receiving information from us, your best option would then to try and move to safety. Move further inland. It's usually recommended that you try to get maybe, if it's maybe a mile inland, or try to move to some higher point to save yourself.
Okay, I have noticed that persons, when there's an earthquake occurring during the day, they seem to panic and rush out of the building and exit the building, and even in having conversations, they will say, I am not staying in the building, I will be exiting the building. So it's very important to stress and for persons to understand the drop, cover, and hold. So why should we drop, cover, and hold versus the building is shaking, let me get out of the building? Why is that important? Great
question, Natalie. You see, most times when persons try to exit the building when the shaking is taking place, that's when they either get killed or they get severely injured. A number of different groups, different, I would say, lessons learned from developed places that may have experienced earthquakes. What they've realized is that most of the persons who either died or were severely injured actually running from the building when the earthquake was taking place. They either got hit with something inside as soon as they got out, some cinder block or something maybe fell on them. So with that data that they collected over the years, they realized those that maybe hid or waited afterwards and then evacuated, those numbers were a lot higher, unlike those that started to run exactly after the shaking took place. All right. Well, before we wrap up, I'll give you this opportunity to leave us with any further information that you want for us to know about the tsunami exercise and how we can prepare ourselves for a disaster. Okay, thank you. The tsunami evacuation exercise, Caribe Wave, will be on the 11th of March, 2021. I encourage persons to register. There is a portal. If you Google Caribe Wave 11, it'll take you to a portal where you can register to participate in this evacuation exercise. I'll also stress that individuals, again, if you're going to take part in the exercise, that you maintain the protocols that have been established. That means if you evacuate, try and keep your distance make sure to wear your mask if you're taking part in exercise.
All right, thank you, Mr. Penn. Definitely the information you've provided gives us some insight and some more thought as to how we should prepare for a disaster.
Thank you for having me.
Participants in the Caribe Wave exercise are asked to practice their response to a tsunami and an earthquake, since this is the most common cause of a tsunami. Regular practice of the tsunami safety response helps ensure persons know what to do if there is a tsunami alert, and it raises awareness about the territory's vulnerability to these rare but potentially dangerous events. That's it for today, guys. I'm Natalie Hodge, signing off. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday to SnapComms, where we bring you news in a snap.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Twitter, and Facebook at BVI Government and Instagram at GISBVI.
SnapComms is brought to you by the Disaster Recovery Coordinating Committee, Government of the Virgin Islands.